So tonight our plan is to finish the epistles of 2nd and 3rd John. If you remember, we finished 1st John last week with the scripture concerning how we should keep ourselves from idols, and the sermon on Sunday discussed that matter more thoroughly. But now we'll go straight into the epistles of 2nd John and 3rd John. So let's go there now. As we look into these scriptures, we'll find that some of the themes that we found already in 1st John continue. For example, the idea that love flows from the truth of who Jesus is. And of course, God is love. And through the wonderful miracle of the Holy Spirit, his love flows through us to others. John also explains that we should abide in the truth and love, not to part from them, not to move away from the concepts of truth and love, but to abide in them. He also discusses clearly in 1 John, and now more in 2nd and 3rd John, the relationship of truth and love. And the other themes that John had in mind in 1st John, one of the main ones was the concept of a new commandment. That is also an old commandment. And remember, his words were that we should love one another. And John had a number of warnings in 1st John, especially to do with the idea of the Antichrist. People who would come along, as prophesied, they would come. They would disrupt the church. Some themselves might say that they are Christ. Some also might say that they follow Christ, but they don't profess Christ in their actions and in their thoughts and in their teachings. In fact, sometimes they go against the very spirit of who Jesus is. And John continues some of those thoughts. Now, as we read 2nd and 3rd John, we'll find that there are a number of people involved. I'd like to mention who some of them are from the beginning, so that when we come to the scriptures involving them, we recognize who they are. One is the elect lady. She's mentioned in 2nd John. In fact, she is the only one to whom one of the New Testament letters is written. The only lady, should I say, to whom one of the New Testament letters is written. Also her children are mentioned, the church that meets in her house, other people involved in the story as we read 2nd and 3rd John are false teachers, visiting speakers, someone called Gaius, someone called Diotrephes, and someone called Demetrius. So as we go through the scriptures, we'll come across these people and we'll find more about them. So let's go immediately to 2nd John verses 1 to 2. John begins. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, the English Standard Version of the Bible. John says, the elder, and by that he means the minister. Perhaps he also means an older minister in the faith. Then he says, to the elect lady. And once again, this is the only letter in the New Testament which is written to a woman. So, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. A number of themes, once again, from John's first epistle. The idea that the truth abides in us, remains in us, and will be with us forever. The elect lady, the concept of perhaps the church, some wonder, who is the elect lady? Some writers suggest perhaps the elect lady is referring to the church or a church. Most, however, will say it is a person, probably the host or the hostess of the church gathering that took place in her house. So a small group setting. And the small group was hosted by this elect lady, a chosen lady. Now verse 3. John writes, grace. And by grace we can say the phrase unmerited favour is nothing that we have done to gain the favour of God. It is unmerited. Excuse me, I have to adjust my chair. Grace, unmerited favour, mercy, meaning divine forgiveness, and peace, meaning peace within our hearts. Ways of looking concerning how to expound those ideas will be with us. This is interesting in 2 John chapter 3 when we read John's introduction. Paul says similar things in his introductions, but normally he says, grace and peace be with you. It's interesting that John says with us. John's writing is very inclusive. It says from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father Son, in truth and in love. That phrase, by the way, Jesus Christ, the Father Son, this is a unique description found only here in 2 John chapter 3. Now we know that Jesus Christ is the Father Son, but as far as the actual phraseology goes, we only find it in this section. Let's continue now to verse 4. So John continues, talking to the lady. I rejoiced greatly to find some of your children walking in faith. Some scholars look at this and they wonder, because the word some is used, does that mean that there were some others who were not walking in truth? I think that's a bit speculative. We don't know clearly, obviously. Anyway, he is delighted. John is delighted that some of the children of the elect lady are walking in the truth, demonstrating their Christian walk, just as we were commanded by the Father. This phrase, of course, is throughout the Epistles of John, the idea of the commandments by the Father. Remember 1 John chapter 3 and verse 23, where we find what commandments are being referred to here. He says, and this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. So there is a commandment for believers, for those who would follow God and follow his Son, Jesus Christ. And that is that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ. Belief is a commandment. And this idea also that we love one another, that too is a commandment, something we are to obey, just as he has commanded us. Now 2 John verses 5 to 6. He says, and now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but one we have from the beginning, that we love one another. Again, this emphasis. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into this world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Remember, this was one of the heresies. People would deny the incarnation, the miracle of God becoming flesh and dwelling among us. If you are someone who would deny that, deny the incarnation, then such a one is a deceiver and the Antichrist. Now verse 8. So he says, and this is a message that he wants, of course, to be passed on to the group that meets in the house of the elect lady. Watch yourselves, so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. The Message rendition of the Bible puts it this way: be very careful around them, these deceivers who would deny Jesus Christ. Be very careful around them so that you don't lose out on what we've worked so diligently in together. So don't lose the focus. And if one does lose the focus, the problem is that we just don't see clearly who Jesus is. Paul says a similar thing in the book of Galatians, talking to this church who were beginning to believe in the deception that some people were presenting to them, the idea that somehow salvation was not through Christ, but through the law. Remember what Paul said in Galatians 4 and verse 11. I am afraid that I may have labored over you in vain. Now let's go to verse 9. Verse 9. Everyone who goes on ahead. This is an interesting thought here. The words or the phraseology in the original language is the idea of going ahead perhaps in thinking, thinking of themselves as progressive thinkers. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. And remember, this is one of the things that John also talked about, how we are called into the fellowship of the Father and of the Son. And so if we don't abide in the teaching of Christ, and Christ said so many things, he gave so many commandments to us, and the words that he spoke, we are expected to put those words into practice. We don't just hear and not do the words of Christ. We listen and we put them into action. The Message rendition says this: anyone who gets so progressive in his thinking that he walks out on the teaching of Christ walks out on God. Very clear connection there. Christ and God. We are called into the fellowship of the Father and of the Son. And if we think that our thinking is so much progressive or so much far ahead of the teachings of Jesus Christ, and we take them in a light way, and we don't regard them with the proper sincerity and integrity in our approach, then the problem is that if we walk out on what Jesus has to say, effectively, we are walking out on God the Father. Whoever stays, however, with the teaching, whoever does that, that person stays faithful to both the Father and the Son. And we are called once again into the fellowship of the Father and the Son. Now verse 10. If anyone in the spirit of Antichrist or an Antichrist comes to you and does not bring this teaching, the teaching of Christ, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. And I put that in brackets, by accepting him or her, the person who's teaching the heresy, we share in that heresy. I know this sounds very harsh to us because we don't like the idea that somehow we don't welcome people. But please remember that the context here. This is talking about some perhaps who were in the church and they have decided that they have outgrown the church's teachings. They no longer follow the teachings of Christ. In fact, some of them don't even follow or accept the concept of the incarnation. I'm reminded of what it says in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 9. Remember this idea of the right hand of fellowship. It says in Galatians 2, verse 9. Paul writes, when James and Cephas, in other words Peter, and John who wrote these epistles, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, Paul, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me. The thought here in 2 John 10 is that we withdraw perhaps this right hand of fellowship because these people are speaking against us, and we have to recognize what they are doing. This is the thought here. I know once again it can sound harsh, but what is John trying to do? His thought is to protect the believers, to protect the people who are in this small church here that meets in the house of the elect lady. The idea is to protect, to safeguard. And this is like a safeguarding concept here. We have to be careful. I remember one incident going back quite some time ago. I'm referring to a part of the world that I don't think any of you would particularly know, where I was attending a church, and there was an elder who began to teach against the teachings of Christ. And the church members respectively asked, with respect, asked the minister to no longer attend until he could talk to me. I thought that's an interesting concept there. They realized the teaching was wrong, and they suggested to the minister that they wait and talk to his supervisor. Now, I don't know if that's exactly an illustration of the scripture, but it is interesting. People might come even into our small congregations and not bring with them the teaching of Christ and intentionally teach otherwise. And the thought here is, if it happens, don't receive and don't get involved in that kind of thing. Now, of course, it should be done with respect, with care, with consideration, all those ideas. But perhaps there's something in this that we can remember should times arise when there is somehow heresy that comes into our congregations, and the heresy teaches against the teaching of Christ. Now let's continue. 2 John verses 12 to 13. John says, though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that and note this inclusive thinking again, so that our joy may be complete. Actually, in the original Greek, it doesn't say face to face, it says mouth to mouth. And I'm glad they've changed it to face. It sounds something that somehow is a bit more acceptable there but the thought in the original Greek is this idea of face to face. Then he finishes this epistle by saying, the children of your elect sister greet you. So did the elect lady have a sister? And some of those children were wherever John was when he wrote this epistle. We don't know all the details. We do know that 2nd and 3rd John probably were written towards the end of the 1st century AD. But we don't know all the specific details. Now let's go to 3rd John. 3rd John, verse 1. 3rd John and verse 1. It says, the elder to the beloved Gaius. Remember we had that list of people who might appear, and here is one of them, Gaius. Probably an elder, probably someone who hosted a church group. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Once again, we have this relationship between love and truth. The truth of who Jesus is guides us into loving one another. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health. Had Gaius been ill? Is this why John mentions his health. We don't know fully, perhaps. So he says, I pray that all will go well with you and that you may be in good health. Again, had Gaius been sick, as it goes well with your soul. Perhaps you think of the song that we love to sing as we read that verse. No, it is well with my soul. Perhaps some of the phraseology comes from this particular section of the Bible here. Now, verse 3. Some comments that John makes about this man, Gaius, probably an elder. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth. In other words, his example, the example of Gaius, spoke for itself. And it was like a testimony to others. And some brothers had come to, or brothers and sisters, I guess. The word brothers, by the way, is in plural in the Greek, and the word means siblings. So it can be brothers and sisters. So when they came to John, and they testified about this man Gaius, it says, as indeed you are walking in the truth. This is a phrase that John uses. No, are you walking in the truth? Are you walking in the faith? Are you being a true Christian in your walk with God? And John knew that Gaius followed Christ. He says, I have no greater joy to hear that my children, and this is a phrase that sometimes Paul uses, my children, my child. John does it as well. Sometimes it's used to refer to people whom the apostles had baptized. So had John baptized Gaius? Maybe. Or perhaps John had also baptized some of those who met in the house of Gaius. My children, he says, are walking in the truth. And as we read some of these scriptures, there's a thought that can come into our mind. What kind of example do we set? Will people say of us that we walk in the truth? And let's get to the next verse. Verse 5. Again talking about Gaius and to a broader extent the church that met in his house. Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers. So these people who had spoken to John about how Gaius had been so Christian to them, they had of course gone to Gaius in the first place. And here John is referring to the hospitality of Gaius, because these were strangers. He didn't know them, but perhaps they had brought with them a letter from John, and Gaius accepted them because John had given them a letter. Again, we don't know all the details, but what we do know is that Gaius and the church there readily welcomed these strangers who testified to your love before the church. So when these brothers go back, they testify of the love of Gaius and of the church that met in Gaius' house. There was a good reputation involved here. Wonder what kind of reputation we have at times. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. So is it that they have gone back again to Gaius? Perhaps this is a missionary kind of journey. They're going on to preach the word. Gaius and the house church's participation in the gospel is clear here, that they are involved in helping these people, these itinerant preachers perhaps, or missionary workers, as they take the gospel around the area, presumably, of Ephesus. Now come to verse 7. It says, for they, these people, these preachers, these missionary workers, they have gone out for the sake of the name. And when we read that, biblically speaking, we're talking about the name of Jesus. And they are accepting nothing from the Gentiles. So they're not trying to gain anything, gain a lifestyle from preaching the gospel. And here we find that Gaius and the group that met in the house of Gaius, they helped these brothers in a physical way, these missionary workers, because as they went out, these missionary workers were not accepting anything from the people that they would preach to, the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. Paul talks a lot about being fellow workers, and here we find John uses the same idea. All of us are that. You, me, all of us combined, we are fellow workers for the truth. John is about to make a contrast between the ministry of Gaius and the ministry of someone called Diotrephes. And some harsh things are written here. When I say harsh, that you can't imagine this kind of thing happening is what I mean. Because when we read of what Diotrephes did, you think, well, how could it have got to that stage? But it did get to that stage. So let's think about contrasting the ministry of Gaius with that of Diotrephes. Diotrephes, we'll see in a few moments, loved the preeminence. He liked to be first. His words, he liked his words to be first, his point of view to be first. He loved the preeminence. And we find that John was wanting to send a letter, some kind of correspondence is involved. Again, we don't know all the details, a message of some sort. But it appears that Diotrephes refuses the correspondence from John and refuses John's superior position. John had some kind of overarching position. He was an apostle, of course. And here we find that this man Diotrephes, was he an elder? Maybe he was. Maybe there was a church that met in his house. But he refuses John. And not only does he refuse John, but he talks malicious gossip against John and against the team with whom John worked. And it goes so far as to prevent some of the pastoral visits. John wants to send some people to see how the group is going there, and Diotrephes prevents their coming. Also, there were some people within the household of Diotrephes or the church that was involved with him who did want to welcome John. But what does Diotrephes do? He disassociates himself with those who would have welcomed John. So this is a very severe situation if you think about it. And John is quite clear about what he thinks. 3 John 9. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, likes to have the preeminence, does not acknowledge our authority. Diotrephes is saying, who is this John? Why should we have anything to do with him? Why should we listen to a single word he says? He refuses the authority of John. He doesn't acknowledge it. It reminds me of the scripture in Jude, which is the small epistle that follows 3 John. Jude verse 16, in the easy-to-read version of the Bible. These people always complain and find wrong in others. This is Jude 16, talking of the kind of people among whom Diotrephes would be numbered. These people always complain and find wrong in others. They always do the evil things they want to do. They boast about themselves. The only reason they say good things about others is to get what they want. So strong words there from Jude. Now, 3 John, verse 10. This is what John intends to do. So, if I come to see Gaius, if I come to see Gaius and the group that meets in Gaius's house, and even the extended group that might be there with Diotrephes, however this configuration exists with the recipients of John's letter. So if I come, I will bring up what Diotrephes is doing. What is he doing? Talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. So clearly, he has some kind of influence, this man Diotrephes, some kind of local authority that he could actually do that. And this is someone who is against what John has to say and what John has to teach. I want to refer to a book for a moment. I don't know whether some of you have come across this book. It's by a man called G. Lloyd Rediger, and the book is called Clergy Killers, and it was written in 1997. I wonder whether this profile would fit Diotrephes. So this is talking about the kind of people that might seek to pull down the ministry. He or she, in other words, a clergy killer, says Lloyd Rediger, he or she is not the normal dissident. We're not just talking about dissidents, he says. Not is he or she the now typical attitude-challenged parishioner. I mean, we all get in bad attitudes from time to time. That's what he's saying. Clergy killers are different. They don't stop. They manipulate. They camouflage. They misrepresent and confuse. They insist that their agenda has priority. Their statements and negotiations are not trustworthy. Spiritual leaders become symbols and scapegoats for the internal pain and confusion they feel. Is this what was happening with Diotrephes? There was something he wanted. Perhaps it was ambition. We don't know. Perhaps he disagreed strongly with some doctrinal thought, and he wanted to have his way. Or maybe it was about position, and the position he didn't have in the church. We don't know the whole story, but it seems that John became a symbol, and John became a scapegoat for the internal pain and confusion that Diotrephes felt. I guess with all of us, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, now, what do we do? How do we feel sometimes about the clergy? Now, I'm not saying the clergy are perfect, so please don't misunderstand, but it's so clear what John was writing about here, that there was someone that stood up and refused John's ministry. These kind of things do happen. And this book, The Clergy Killers, talks about those ideas. Let's continue now. 3 John 11. 3 John 11. Beloved. And when John says beloved, he's talking about that concept of where we are loved with the agape love of God. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Don't follow the example of Diotrephes. Rather follow a better example, perhaps of Gaius, or of someone else that John is about to talk about. Whoever does good is from God, but whoever does evil has not seen God. John then presents someone who does good. Is this another minister? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's a lay member of the group there. We don't know the whole story. But John gives another example. Don't imitate bad examples, says John. Imitate good examples. And here he gives an example, Demetrius. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone. This is 3 John 12. Whoever this Demetrius is, he has received a good testimony from everyone. Everyone speaks well of this person. And not just from all the people, but from the truth itself. Demetrius demonstrates the truth in loving action. That's the thought here. And we know it, says John and the brothers, the people that John was involved with. We also add our testimony. It's not just that everyone sees the good example of Demetrius, but John too confirms it. He knows how good the example of Demetrius is. And you know that our testimony is true. It's so obvious. So, again, what is John saying? He's writing to Gaius. He's explaining how Gaius has set a good example in so many ways. Then he mentions this man Diotrephes and the bad example that he has set, even to the extent of rejecting John and the teachings of Christ. And so John says, don't imitate the bad example, but rather imitate the good example. And here is another one, in addition to that of Gaius, Demetrius, this one who has a good testimony with everyone, this one that shows love in action, this person whose testimony is very clear to John and to John's associates. Now we go to verse 13. In fact, John ends 3 John in a similar way to 2 John. And they're quite short letters. They could have been longer, obviously, but John doesn't get around to saying what he was going to write. He says, I had much to write to you. Maybe you've done such a thing. So many things you wanted to write, but in the end, you just write a small letter, a short letter. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. Maybe his eyes were not quite so good. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Here's this Greek phrase again, mouth to mouth. Better translated, face to face. 3 John 15, the last verse. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, every one of them. Of course, the word friends is important to John. He was there in John 15 and verse 14, when Christ explained to the disciples, and through them to us, that you are the friends of Christ if you do what Christ commands you. And we know what that was, to love one another. And this is what John has been talking about in 1 John and 2 John and in 3 John, that we love one another. It's wonderful how John ends with a very inclusive note. No, the friends greet you, he said. Greet the friends, every one of them. Don't miss anyone out. John ends with a note of affection and inclusion. Well, that brings us to the end of the study this evening. I had thought it might have been longer. Sorry, it's shorter than I thought it was going to be. And this is the last of the series on the epistles. We're now going to switch to another Bible study series. Some of you, or most of you perhaps, have seen the book here, We Believe. And next week at 7:30 p.m., a week today, Gavin will be leading the Bible study. And so if you have your book available at that time, that would be good. And you could follow along with some of the things that he discusses from this book. Don't forget that we have Zoom services at the weekend in our various congregations, and also we have a streamed sermon this coming Sunday. It is from Gavin this weekend at 11 a.m. So thank you very much for joining me in this study, and I look forward to the next time